That's incredibly interesting. So, in that case, let me bring in two of my other interviewees. Would you tend to agree more with Kevin Kelly, who says that believers in the singularity commit thinkism, or with Jaron Lanier, who thinks that a singularity is just like a new religion for geeks, just like the rapture of the nerds idea?
I alternate between these two views. I try to be an agnostic on
Mm-hmm.
this issue. My main feeling is that the idea of a hard takeoff singularity, of a rapidly self-bootstrapping transcendent AI, makes some naive assumptions about the nature of intelligence, of what intelligence is, and even how desirable it is. Another part of the problem, as I see it, is the idea of mind uploading. Again, Hans Moravec's thought experiment in Mind Children in the late 1980s, the idea you replace one neuron after another in a brain until you've scooped out the whole brain without the human losing consciousness. That's a good model and a fairly interesting argument for why mind uploading might be possible. But first of all, we need to determine at what level of neuroanatomy we need to simulate to get an accurate representation of a mind. Do we even need to go all the way down to the individual cellular level? Do we need to go lower? Do quantum effects have any influence? I tend to think Roger Penrose is talking out of his arse when he asserts that they do, but it is something we seriously need to examine. So the whole mind uploading thing is something that in Jaron Lanier's terms, the nerds have jumped on as a new religion. The idea that we're all going to go flying up to upload heaven. I think we should be very, very skeptical about the idea that the singularity, if it happens, will have any room for human beings in it. Mm-hmm. My new novel, what comes out next month, titled Rule 34, among other things, has a bit of an examination of a particular type of artificial intelligence in it, one that I think is probably more likely than the self-bootstrapping, self-improving variety of a mind upload variety. There is actually a scene in which somebody utters the dreaded words, "Tell me, Professor." Well, a cop who's asking a professor of artificial intelligence just how a particular piece of software works. The talking head academic makes the point, when designing an artificial intelligence, the one thing we don't want it to do is to be conscious. If we can emulate a human mind accurately in a computer, this isn't going to do any work for us. It's not going to be useful. It's going to want to sit by the swimming pool, sipping pina coladas and indulging in fantasies, or watch Premier League football or something. It's not a very productive use of computing resources. If we do actually learn enough about how consciousness works, or how intelligence works, or computer, or how to write software that does what human minds do, the last thing we're going to want to do is to actually emulate a real human mind, unless we have an actual mechanism for mind upload for survival-oriented reasons. Again, here we're getting back to Aubrey de Grey, and I'm inclined to think it would be nicer to have indefinitely prolonged good health and youthful activity in our own bodies than to necessarily have to upload to escape a rotting meat sack, as it were, which is the alternative mechanism.
Yeah.
So whether we may actually hit a point where we develop the capability to build artificial intelligences, but we don't want to, for some reason. This also keys in with, for example, the Fermi paradox, where one possible answer to it isn't that there's nobody out there, but that there is something we haven't anticipated that causes any species capable of going the interstellar colonization route to decide there's something better to do with their time instead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in that case, how do you view in that framework the work of people such as Henry Markram's Blue Brain project, or the parallel work done by IBM, who, according to their own timeline, claim that by 2018 they would have a completely modeled and fully operational simulation of a complete human brain?
I can certainly see it having an enormous amount of merit for research purposes. if it can be done, we will do it eventually. What I would quibble with is the desirability of doing it for something other than actual pure research in neurocomputing. You know, it's not necessarily something you can productize or make much use of other than as a research tool. I'd also add there are very serious ethical problems with simulating a human mind. Once you've got one running in a box, is it murder if you flick the off switch? Greg Egan raised this point relatively recently about using genetic algorithms to evolve actual artificial intelligence. He's pretty much recanted his earlier view that it was a good idea to use it as a shortcut by realizing that the penultimate stages you get to before you have your definite AI are arbitrarily close to being true AI. And every time you do the recombination and respawn thing, you're basically rendering them extinct. His view is that you're actually having to commit genocide to develop an artificial intelligence, and that this is morally unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me ask you then about Ray Kurzweil and his work. He's often being criticized for being too optimistic, way too optimistic, in both in his projections and in his take on the singularity and on its effects on us. You just mentioned a few minutes ago that you're not completely sure that there may be a space for our species after any potential singularity. So how would you rate our chances of survival if there were to be a singularity after all?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the shape of the singularity and where it originates, and also how we end up interacting with it at the time. Leaving aside the singularity, it's fairly clear that we face a number of very major existential challenges this century just getting through them. We're confronting a period where petrochemicals are going to become increasingly difficult to get hold of, or rather more expensive. They're not going to run out, they're just going to get pricier to extract. Where we can't continue burning really dirty coal without messing with the climate badly. We've just had a complete clusterfuck in Japan that has probably set back any hope of nuclear rollout by a decade at a minimum. Fusion is still 30 years away, and to make matters worse, it may remain 30 years away for a long time because, unfortunately, there are major drawbacks to fusion power that aren't widely publicized. For one thing, we can't do it without neutrons. I'm not even going to get started on the whole lunar helium-free pipe dream. Basically, we have a real major emergency of a climatological nature. We have a global free trade and capital flow system that appears to have become pathological. A lot of people are very upset with the way things are going. We have a global rollout of a security state that's quite terrifying. And while all this is happening, several other things are going on. We are seeing the populations of China and India develop economically to first world standards of living in a single generation, and that's nearly 3 billion people. To put that in perspective, there's currently only 1 billion people in the developed world, in Europe, North America, and bits of the Pacific Rim. The environmental footprint of quadrupling the number of people in the developed world is pretty scary, but they're not going to stay down on the farm and poverty-stricken as peasants. They're just not going to accept that. Neither would we if we were in their shoes. And then there's Africa developing. This one is the dog that didn't bark. But while during the 1990s, Africa underwent the third major war of the 20th century after the First and Second World Wars, the First and Second Congo Wars, overall, Africa is lots better off than it was 20 years ago. Africa as a continent has been experiencing roughly 6% economic growth per year for a decade. They're still very, very poor, but it's the poverty of Europe in the 1860s rather than Europe in the 1660s. Given another generation, Africa will be poised to make the same giant developmental leap forward as India and China. By 2050, we could well be looking at a world where we have 8 or 9 billion people expecting a developed world standard of living. That's going to change a lot of things immensely. the center of gravity of politics, the center of gravity of economic and technological development. China is now producing more scientific papers than the United States or Europe. And it's not going to stop there. What happens when Africa, with triple the population, well, with a bigger population than India, China, and the US and Europe combined, starts actually producing on that scale? There's no way of knowing where that one's going to end, but it's enormous, and I'd like to live long enough to see where these changes are taking us. Interestingly, there's another crisis that appears to have been defused. During the 1970s, people were obsessed with a population time bomb. But every decade since then, the UN has been revising its estimates of peak human population down, and not in small increments, but by 1 billion a time. They're now looking at a peak human population of between 9 and 10 billion people by the end of the century, and then dropping thereafter. We could well be back to our current population level within a century if the death rate stays where it is today, although I don't think it will. We have already passed peak children as opposed to peak oil. The birth rate worldwide is now dropping significantly. And if you were to wave a magic wand and give Aubrey de Grey his dream, namely indefinite life prolongation, well, the interesting side effect of that, we wouldn't be able to eliminate actual death. Just natural accidents and attrition would probably limit a human average life expectancy to 600 or 700 years. But our population wouldn't peak much higher than 9-10 billion, even if we had immortality at this point. It's just that the peak would be sustained for longer.
Okay, let me close our interview here with the traditional 3 questions that I ask of all my interviewees. And that is, first of all, would you like to share with us what are you working on at the moment, or any future plans for the next couple of years?
That's fairly easy. I'm actually talking quite freely about the books I'm currently under contract for. Right now, I'm working with Cory Doctorow on The Rapture of the Nerds, which is a humorous look at a post-singularity world from the point of view of a curmudgeonly green who spends a lot of his time screaming and running away from high-tech manifestations, things like bicycles. I am also working to get the 4th novel in my laundry sequence finished, which is due to be handed in later this year for publication next year. That's, if you like, the Lovecraftian horror singularity. The book that's coming out next, in fact next month, Rule 34, is it's a near-future novel. It's set in the same universe as Halting State. It focuses on the future of crime and criminology from the point of view of a detective trying to solve a very, very peculiar crime. It's near future, and I probably shouldn't spoiler it too much, but I should say that the phrase panopticon singularity is used in it. Think in terms of a singularity with ubiquitous law enforcement. I believe Vernor Vinge has had something to say on this in the past. I decided to take a look at it up close and personal.
Very interesting.
And going beyond that, I have a couple of novels under contract, but I haven't started work on yet, including a space opera and a 3rd near-future novel.
Very interesting. So what is the best place for one to go and find information both about you and about the work that you're doing and that you have upcoming?
The first place to look is on my website and blog, which is www.accelerando.org. That's far and away the easiest entry point.
Yes, and it's just like the book too, which was the first work of you that I read. And finally, if you had one message that you wanted our viewers and listeners to take away from this interview today, what would you like it to be?
If anyone ever gives you a narrative about the future or the human condition or the world we live in that purports to explain everything, and it's simple, elegant, and appealing and internally consistent, it's almost certainly wrong. The real world is complicated.
And with this answer, I'd like to thank Charles Stross for taking time to be here with us today. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you very much for having me.
It was my pleasure entirely. Thanks again.